Here. Okay, we are up and running on why all governments will eventually collapse. Late stage statism explained by Esoteric the REKT. Actually, Esoteric the Free, but we've renamed him, haven't we? Now, I did just have a bit of a. It felt like a dud. It felt like a misfire. Finishing off the article that I just did about Ayn Rand, because we ended up with a lead into the metaphysics of morals, groundworks of the metaphysics of morals, which is a 300-page book by Immanuel Kant. So that's a heck of a lead. But that will be our next video on that subject. Now let's do some Esoteric the Free. I have to warn you, I haven't watched this video. I'm not sure if we will agree with him on this stuff or not, but I doubt that he's going to be very reasonable. Let's see.
An education system which only exists to make people uncritically obedient, now at the point where objectively demonstrable facts are disregarded, and the only factor which matters in grading is if you follow the teacher's instructions. The said system being proposed to promote critical thinking. The government bombing a majority of the world, even though they haven't officially declared war with any country since 1942. Despite this, the number of bombs being set off are increasing annually at a systematic rate and have been since the early 1980s. Despite the purported changes in ideologies and approaches to foreign policy, this allows all governments to wage war while simultaneously declaring that there are no wars.
All right, what the hell's going on? Is this... Oh, God. All right, this is the last time that I ever try this. I just thought this would be a good video to do. I apologize. I should have watched this first. This is a mess. What are we watching? Okay, this is why all governments will eventually collapse. So this is late stage statism. This is what's going on. Now, does that mean that government collapse is coming near? Is it close? Is anarchy a religion? Holy shit, is it a religion? Including a coming collapse or something? The coming reckoning for our sins? Oh my God, is anarchy a religion?
And the destruction of the mere ability to have philosophical discussions by creating labels such as right-wing or left-wing for people to put themselves in, which are vague to the point where they encompass self-conscious.
Now, that's interesting here. The Republicans and Democrats are both owned by the same organization. Do you know where that's true? That's true almost everywhere except America. I can't speak to every little country around the world, but certainly in Britain, in France, in Germany, it doesn't matter who you vote for. The deep state owns everything, and it's going to go in one direction and one direction only. All right, so that's interesting. I mean, look at Trump. Is Trump owned by the same entities that the Democrats are in favor of and own? I don't know. Maybe you say they are. I don't know.
Contradictory ideas, but simultaneously attempt to apply to any and every idea, the intention being to rob the population of the ability to conceive of any other political reality other than being subjugated to the state, and simultaneously giving them the notion that they have control over this state as long as they utilize it to fight their neighbors who have different interests. Now, if this sounds like some sort of Orwellian hellscape to you, you'd be right, because everything which I just explained is literally George Orwell's description of how Ingsoc controlled the population in 1984.
Okay. That did feel really down the rabbit hole there. Okay, so that was George Orwell's passage. Okay.
However, everything which I just explained is true about every government in the world today. Though, to be fair, the declarations of war bit is exclusive to the US, but every other country is similar in that they're fighting their own, if not the exact same undeclared wars the US is in. But that's aside from the point. All governments are Orwellian like this. I mean, the social contract and the idea that politicians represent you while you never actually gave any consent, and the politicians have...
What's voting? if you never gave consent? You give consent when you vote. So you're saying if you don't go vote and you still get represented, well, go vote. Vote for your guy. But this is the fantasy world they live in, where every single government is equal because they are all have some platonic thing in common, and they can't tell the difference between a good government and a bad government. I think the United States is just as bad as Soviet Russia. This is their issue.
Complete dominion over every aspect of everyone's lives. But my point is that they seem to be getting worse, and not only this, but all failed states in history seem to have identical characteristics in the waning years of their reign as the modern states do as they're reaching their end. Former Soviet citizens, for example, in the last few years of the Soviet Union, describe a political landscape which, quote, made them feel as if reality was breaking down. The Roman Empire constantly waged wars with any other country they could, then claimed that every single one of them was an act of self-defense, and the British Empire...
Well, let me make a little correction there. I don't know exactly what he's referring to, but Rome was requested to go into virtually every single territorial war it ever entered. And it was requested by either one side or the other of any given war. Rome almost never advanced in a sort of belligerent territorial expansionist way. They virtually always were invited or begged or paid by one side or the other to come help in a war. They were invited in virtually every single place they ever went. Just to, whatever, I don't know that it's a substantive thing to say, but it's true.
The other country they could, then claimed that every single one of them was an act of self-defense, and the British Empire kept trying to...
I mean, they didn't claim that it was self-defense. Sometimes they claimed, sometimes it was just realpolitik. They just went in, they probably liked to have a veneer of self-defense in one way or another. Probably
take control of the other countries of the world for their resources due to the dying state of their command mercantilist economy, just to name a few examples. One was an act of self-defense, and the British Empire kept trying to take control of the other countries of the world for their resources due to the dying state of their command mercantilist economy, just to name a few examples.
The dying state of their command mercantilist economy? Their economy was in ascendancy. It was the ascendant economy of the world. I'm not sure he really has a very good grasp on what was happening economically. When Britain was at its height, it was going around the world taking over countries and bringing resources back. It was not on life support. It was not an anemic, dying country. It was the most advanced country in the world, and it needed resources for its industries. So I'm not sure he has a very good grasp of economics, or he doesn't have a very good grasp of history or the facts of history, or his ideology clouds his ability to understand events even when he does read about them.
So I've done a bit of research into the peculiar phenomena that I've been observing, but I haven't made a full video explaining what I've found, despite the fact that I've mentioned it several times by name. So today I'm going to be explaining what late-stage statism is and why it occurs. So late statism is a thesis which proposes that all governments are fundamentally determined to fail as a result of structural flaws inherent to the government's functioning.
So this is Marxism. Marxism in rose-colored glasses, or Marxism with a dress on, or something like that.
And these problems, as well as any government's reaction to them and consequent attempts to do damage control after they surface, are identical and can be observed to repeat itself. I mean, this should be made self-evident when you see that thousands of governments have existed throughout history. Most of them don't even survive a century, and 99% of them have already collapsed and are now either defunct or reformed in some new form. But in case it hasn't...
Well, does it jar any of your pea-brained brain cells that these governments keep getting replaced? Did that ever occur to you? These governments keep getting replaced. Every time they fall apart, a new one takes their place. For what reason? Why? Because people in a given geographic region want to have someone hold the monopoly on force. People want that. They don't want there to be competition with the monopoly on force.
And here's an explanation as to why all governments will inevitably fail. So, whether or not you believe in government, the function of a government by design is something which everyone can agree with. A small group of people come forward and declare that they are the only ones allowed to arbitrate within a said geographical area, and consequently have the ability to rule whatever they please.
That's not how it works, is it? They don't come forward and say, we are the only ones who can arbitrate. I mean, sometimes, yeah, that's certainly what Stalin did. But sometimes they come forward and they say, here are our new rules. And then they go melt back into the populace. Now, of course, he can't understand that, because that would mean there would be a law that is just stands by itself and there's nobody behind the law. And he couldn't understand such a thing. For him, a law means a ruler, and he must be Canadian. He must not be American.
Please is legitimate even if it has no explanatory power. This is why people are forced to pay taxes, and it isn't considered theft even though there are no discernible differences. Why police could just kill anyone they want for no reason and get a paid vacation, while if...
All right, now I've heard that before. Where did I hear that before? Police go to prison all the time, and forced taxation. The more I hear you guys harp on it, the less mad I am about it, because I realize, you know, our taxes would be cut, the government would be more efficient, our taxes would be much lower. Instead of paying 40% of our incomes, we'd pay 20% for the same amount of government service, and blah, 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 and we'd have more power over the government. True, true, true. But still, we would be paying something for our government, wouldn't we? We would be paying for some defense agency, even in their fantasy world. Some part of our income would go to pay for local police and courts and military. So I'm less worried all the time about it, especially when the people who want to replace it are these morons. But at some point, we are going to have to face the fact that if the government can just tell us how much to give it, then it's going to take more than it should be taking. And that if we give voluntarily to the government, like church tithing, then the government's going to have to come up with something to ramp us up and get us to want to give. And so maybe we're going to have to strike some sort of a balance between them. I don't know. Do you really want the government spending its time trying to figure out how to get money from the people? Advertising campaigns, wars, whatever gets the people hyped up to give money. So maybe we should just have a constant flat tax rate and just try to keep it as low as we can. And all right, so that's my thinking on forced taxation. I'm just not that worried. I mean, I do want everybody in society to pay part. I don't want it to be 50 or 70% of us paying and 30 or 50% of us riding free on the expenses of military and whatever else, courts and police. All right, all right.
If someone who is not a government employee so much as pokes a cop, they can be arrested for fourth-degree assault and an extra charge assaulting a police officer. Well, regardless, this coercive system necessarily requires an enforcement mechanism.
You know, those laws came about through public demand, because we had situations where people would assault a police officer, and there was no more charge to that than just assaulting anybody on the street. And they would get whatever, you know, what was reasonable for punching a guy on the street. And we decided that people, when the cops show up, people need to realize that it's not time to start punching the cops. And anyone who thinks it is time to start punching the cops is in really, really big trouble. So punching some dude on the street is not going to get you several years or something like that. It's probably just going to get you probation. But you punch a cop, yeah, that's serious. And the reason for that is we did not want people to, we did not want cops to show up to a given place and have people go crazy and start punching them and beating them up. We wanted there to be very, very, very serious consequences for assaulting a cop. These are from public demand. The public demands these, and if these laws were not in place, then we would, the public would riot until the laws were in place. So,
since without it, there would be nothing stopping competitors from entering the market. And since it doesn't actually produce any resources, this makes it dependent on private producers like any other private DRO. The difference is that unlike a DRO, the state doesn't actually produce any resources, an enforcement mechanism, since without it, there would be nothing stopping competitors from entering the market. And
what market?
Government employees so much as pokes a cop, they can be arrested for 4th-degree assault and an extra charge assaulting a police officer.
Okay.
Well, regardless, this coercive system necessarily requires an enforcement mechanism, since without it, there would be nothing stopping competitors from entering the market. And since it doesn't actually...
Oh, the enforcement mechanism means maintaining the monopoly.
Produce any resources, this makes it dependent on private producers like any other private DRO.
Now, why doesn't the government produce resources? Do these guys ever stop and think about why the government doesn't produce resources? Why is it a money pit? Why is it a hole? And what happens when the government does take over the production of resources and use a gun to decide how to produce? Do they know the story about Soviet Russia? Do they know the story? There's a book called East minus West equals zero. And it's about how everything that Russia had came from the West. Like every single thing. Even their steel mills. We shipped to them during World War II, and they were still using those same steel mills when their damn government fell apart in the 1990s. So, East minus West equals zero. The government can't produce anything. It's hard enough. Look at it this way, ladies and gentlemen. It's hard enough for independent people who are working their heart out for their own livelihood to support their wife and kids. It's hard enough for them to make a business work. How is a bureaucrat going to do it who's just there punching the clock and then he goes home and doesn't care it's other people's money? How's he going to make a business work? You know, it takes an entrepreneur all day, every day of his life to run a business properly. So how is some bureaucrat going to do it spending other people's money he doesn't care about? Of course, that's not possible. Guess what? A lot of those businessmen can't run their businesses, right? They go broke. Lots of businesses go broke. Restaurants go broke. Everybody goes broke, right? Steel mills that used to be profitable shut down. Well, maybe it's because of the unions or whatever, but companies don't last forever. Companies are brilliant for a while. So companies are very delicate, very difficult, very rare, very amazing. They only exist because nobody can use physical force against them, and you can't take them for granted. They disappear very quickly and very easily. That's why governments can't produce anything. Half of regular society can't even produce anything. They have to work for the other half, who are actually able to be productive. So, of course, governments can't produce anything spending other people's money and not giving a damn about the resources. So that's if they end up with their dream world of governments trying to be efficient, they are going to be in a world where Stalin is efficiently putting people on trains and putting them in a gulag and having them run his linen factories or whatever, slave labor, digging canals and stuff, because that's efficient. I mean, if you don't have a government to protect your rights, then being able to logically deduce that you have rights isn't going to convince somebody that's trying to enslave you.
Difference is that unlike a DRO, the state steals from people using its various services, which are enforced by the police and the military, which they also own and control. Unlike a DRO, which is dependent on its customers and engages with them voluntarily.
Why would it do that? Who would stop? What if it didn't? What if the DRO didn't engage with its customers voluntarily? Who would stop it from doing that? Is there literature on that? What if there was a DRO that got out of control? The other DROs would attack it and destroy it, or would they just submit some paperwork somewhere?
The state must do this since it doesn't produce any services, yet requires the ability to provide services in order to sustain itself.
The state does produce things some places, right? I mean, state oil is a thing that, but they require the resources and thought of the West in order to do it. But cars are produced. Funny, cars are produced in India according to some design from some free country. So it's funny how that, but they are able to produce something. Amtrak produces something, don't they? I don't know. I'm actually having a hard time. NASA produces something, right? All right, so the state can produce something. The problem is just that it's extraordinarily expensive. It's not economic. It's not economical. They can't make a profit. Can the state make a profit? They loaned a bunch of money to banks and took back more than they loaned. They made a profit. The state can make a profit. Now, do we want them to? That's the question, isn't it? The state can get into production. It's garbage at it. The state can make a profit. It doesn't do it, swallows it up. Do we want them to? I don't want the state to be in production. I want the state to be on a very, very short leash. And I want them to do, because they are the people with guns, I want them to do exactly what we designed them to do and no more. Now, I'm not saying that the United States of America is perfect. It's a pretty good system, though. And so it's a facsimile of what we'll have in the future if we are able to improve all societies around the world. They'll look more like the United States of America, where you basically go about your life and do your own thing, and nobody bothers you as long as you don't bother anybody else. You know, and all the way to getting a house, getting millions of dollars, having cars, having airplanes. As long as you don't bother anybody else or hurt anybody else, no one's going to bother you. As long as you obey the law and you're not fraudulent and whatever. There's a lot of freedom in America. And that's what we're going to have all around the world, a system more like this. Now, these guys take exception to it. How? Oh, these poor bastards. If they ever get their wish, they are going to end up with some sort of Stalinist hellhole. That's what anarchy is going to. If they get their wish and enough people believe in anarcho-capitalism and they overthrow the government, it is very, very quickly going to be a killing field.
But this is a problem for a variety of reasons. As new industries come into existence and the population expands with more people associating with more commodities,
populations don't necessarily always expand, as we know about Japan now, right? See, he takes these things for granted. He just thinks that the economy is ever onward, upward, growing, more people, more jobs, more factories, more towns, more houses. He just takes this world for granted. He thinks all that would exist even without the government. God, just look at Syria and see if all that would exist without the government.
The government has to expand itself because these extra people and new industries require them to utilize more resources in order to maintain the services they provide. So sorry, minarchists, but the government always will inevitably expand its influence over the market and propose ridiculous tax rates out of necessity. Anyway.
All right, so what he's proving there is that the government will grow out of bounds no matter what, because as the economy grows and changes, that the statists will grab more power. So it's impossible to have a static state or something like that. Well, there is something called written law. There's the Constitution. They just don't believe in that. Somebody said in one of the comments, they said, well, what about, you've got your stupid Constitution in the United States, and you're asking, what if Stalin comes along? How are we going to stop him? What if Stalin comes along in the United States? How's the United States going to stop him? Now, that's a really stupid question. The United States did stop him. We actually faced Stalin, and then Stalin died, and then we faced the system that Stalin built, and we won. We beat it. So what would your system do against Stalin? We know what Europe would have done without us. They would have collapsed. They would have all been under Stalin.
So here are the main two issues with this. Firstly, any service which operates around an exponential growth curve is inherently unsustainable, and basic economic concepts such as scarcity can explain why.
All right. Is it true that exponential growth curves are unsustainable? Look at oil. Oil has been growing exponentially. Look at the size of our economy. It's been growing exponentially. Look at the money supply. You can look at a lot of different things. Electricity production. You can look at a lot of different things that they grow. I don't know if exponential is the right word, but they grow by 6% per year or 4% per year. And the thing is, once you're in your 7th year or 11th year or 14th year or whatever, the growth that year is equivalent to the entire system, 7 years before or whatever, 11 years before, which means that the amount of oil we are using this year, 2019, the amount of oil that human beings are using this year is equal to all of the oil used in the history of mankind up to some recent year, like 20, 25, 30 years ago. Maybe less than that, maybe 8 or 10 or 12 years ago. So all of the oil used in the history of mankind, we use more than that, up to, say, the year 2000. We use more than that this year. That's what exponential growth means. Now, it's amazing that that can keep happening. It can't necessarily keep happening with everything. Of course, it would swallow up the entire earth. But for example, with economies, you might have looked at the economy in the year 1800 and said, well, it can only grow to a certain size. But you would be wrong, because there are places for the economy to grow you had no idea. There are vertical real estate in the form of skyscrapers, and that makes the real estate around that real estate more valuable. There is banking and loaning all around the world. Loans can be made. That is a huge part of the economy. It's not just, so in the 1800s, you would have looked at the economy and said, how many hay fields can you have? How many cows can you have? Gee, I actually forgot where I was coming. I hope everything was good there. That was good, whatever I was talking about.
Why this is. On top of this, there's the problem we've already gone over of states not being able to produce any commodities or resources, nor do...
They can. We just don't want them to. They're very bad at it, and it's better for us to do it. It's much better for us to do it, and even we're not that good at it.
Government services have supply or demand curves, so they can't innovate new resources into existence either. In fact, they can't even efficiently distribute commodities because of this. Secondly, this necessitates the existence of a monopoly on credit, which leads me into my next point. Because all government services operate on an exponential growth curve, the mere concept of a scarce private money, which has competitive and independent issuers of credit, are antithetical to the existence of a state. This on top of the other
What kind of money is antithetical to the existence of a state?
Existence either. In fact, they can't even efficiently distribute commodities because of this. Secondly, this necessitates the existence of a monopoly on credit, which leads me into my next point.
Necessitates a monopoly on credit.
Because all government services operate on an exponential growth curve, the mere concept of a scarce private money, which has competitive and independent issuers of credit, are antithetical to the existence of a state. This on top of the other established problems.
What is he saying? States have to have control of their money supply? The United States didn't up until 1913.
We've already gone over, make the state dependent on central banking, or determined to eventually resort.
Not true. Historically not true. It's not true. Just because a lot of modern states use it doesn't mean that that's an essential of governance. So, is that what he's saying? I hope I misunderstand him. I hope he's not that ignorant of historical fact.
Top of the other established problems we've already gone over, make the state dependent on central banking, or determined to eventually resort to central banking.
Okay.
The state's inability to actually produce any commodities and rely.
So he's just saying eventually the state's going to move towards central banking. It's too tempting. I agree. So why don't we write a law that prevents them from doing that? Why don't we just legally not give them the power to do that? How would that be?
Reliance on forceful redistribution ensure that they cannot ever create money which has scarcity and is valuable in and of itself simply because it was once a preferred medium of exchange and has so many characteristics that give it an even higher level of.
All right, if he's got his panties in a bunch about the government and the money supply, how about we have a government that uses gold as the money supply, as the default money supply, and doesn't tell the citizenry what to do about money and just taxes them in gold? How would that be? Would that work for you? And doesn't tax them in gold, takes government tithing, voluntary government tithing instead of taxation. No taxation, just voluntary government tithing in gold. Would that satisfy you? Because as an anarchist, I'm trying to come up with a state that would satisfy the anarchists and say you can have the things you want in a state that like this here, but you can't have the things that you want if you do away with the state. It's required that you have the state.
Of marginal utility to where it's only valued as an intermediate point between exchanges. This means that the two modes of currency which could ever be issued by the state will either be reserve notes or fractional reserve banking. Reserve notes are notes issued by the state which the state claims can be exchanged at any time for a preferred medium of exchange, usually coming in the form of gold or silver. These are unsustainable because as the economy expands, the state will end up producing more currency than they have or could ever possibly have in reserve to back up its value.
Well, there have been instances where we had extra gold reserves or extra silver reserves. So that's not true. There was a time when we had the streets of a city in Colorado lined with silver bars because we were producing so much silver. So it's not true. And when we did that, we were worried about silver, the effect of silver on the money supply, if there was too much silver around, and there was debate that went on for a couple of decades about silver in the money supply. So you can have
the state will end up producing more currency than they have or could ever possibly have in reserve to back up its value.
All right, well, China has had hundreds of billions of dollars. Russia had $500 billion in reserves built up from the high oil prices. It spent it all. So he's not right. The government in Norway has massive monetary reserves. Yeah, I mean, he's just looking at the way some out-of-control governments today behave, and he just takes that to be the essential way that governments as such behave. And that's pretty shallow, pretty uninformed. He's ignorant of a lot of things that go on right in the world around us. I mean, Russia and China have hundreds of billions of dollars in extra reserves, and governments are always and only going to overspend their money supply. That's not true.
This is exactly what happened in 1971 when France realized that their government alone had more US dollars than the US claimed it had in gold reserves. So most governments of the world en masse attempted to exchange their dollars for gold, which created a feedback loop that caused the US to either have the dollar default or get off gold reserve standard. And
oh, well, we had been responsible. I mean, we had been irresponsible with our gold situation for well over a decade, couple of decades, I'm sure, maybe even going back into the 30s, we had been irresponsible. So in 1971, when Nixon, or was it 72, when he took us off the gold standard? I mean, so yeah, you cannot take that to be an essential of statehood. You cannot take that to be an essential functioning of what governments do. That's just what one stupid government did with some bad policy at one point in history. But he takes that to be, he essentializes that.
Fractional reserve banking, which is what a reserve currency will always inevitably lead to, create currency out of thin air. More specifically, the Federal Reserve in the case of the US requests that the Treasury Department, on behalf of investment banks, print new money. Then the Treasury Department will claim that it'll pay the Federal Reserve back with interest by increasing taxes. It should be relatively easy to see how this literal debt-based economy, which by design can only cause devaluation and poverty, is unsustainable. And the state's monopoly on credit.
Now, look, it's a travesty, okay? It's a travesty. The system's pretty bad, okay? But let's look at it for a second. Look. Oh, it's bad, all right? The government should not own the money supply, okay? Now, if the government does get to print money or coin money, if the government's in control of the money supply, as it is in the United States Constitution, and the government prints some money and spends it on hiring people and buying lumber, and it builds some warships. Okay? Nobody handed that money to the government. It just printed it out of thin air, and it went to these people and handed them this money. That the thing is, if you get money, you've done something for somebody. You worked at a job or something. If the government prints money, they haven't done anything for anybody. And so then they get their warships, and now they've got their warships, and you're looking at those warships and you're saying, those filthy bastards printed that money. And they've basically stolen that from the economy because they didn't put any services in to get those warships. Normally they would have had to put a lot of services into the economy and to gather up all this money that people gave them voluntarily. And once they had all that, then they could do their warships. No, they just printed it. Okay, so you're upset at them. I say having those warships is some value. It's some value. And what about if they build some police stations and a courthouse and hire a judge and hire some police officers? And they're just printing money to pay these people, right? Is that any value to us? So I would want to restrict a lot of what the government does. One of the things I would definitely want to restrict is them controlling the money. But I just want to point out that if the government was not spending on crazy shit like welfare spending and stuff, if the government was only the police, the courts, and the military, then their spending is not a damage to society, right? It allows society to continue. It allows society to do its thing. So I just think that these guys really, really hate everything the government does and have a real violent animus towards anything the government does, not realizing that is a benefit to us to have these things, and that we would be spending this stream of money on some form of protection or security, police, courts, military. We would be spending this money in any type of society we live in. So there we go. That's my...
is where the structural flaws start leading to politicians being compelled to act in what seem to be incredibly bizarre ways on the surface, but if you start examining the effects of what they're doing as an aggregate rather than listening to what they claim to ideologically support, then it starts to make more sense. So too long didn't watch. Governments fundamentally by design have to increase spending, and as the market becomes larger, the state will need to spend more to manage more. This is the reason why states will perpetually expand their influence over society and why states require a monopoly on credit. So okay,
all right, those aren't actually historically, factually the case. Some states do get smaller, some states disintegrate. Look at the Soviet Union, it fell apart. But I guess that's late stage. So he says states will always get bigger, they'll always expand. Unless and until they don't, right? I mean, he did start off talking about the Soviet Union's collapse, right? So states always get bigger and always expand. But what about when they don't or can't? What about when they downsize? What about when they privatize? What about when they get rid of services that they used to own? Does that ever happen? No, the state only expands. It's evil. It only gets bigger. See, they view the state, they do not view the state through rational eyes, these anarchists, do they? They view the state irrationally as some sort of evil. And they just cannot see anything about the state. It is always and only evil, anything the state does, isn't it? It is like an article of faith to them. And these guys are looking more and more like a religion. Oh boy, the ANCAP religion. Who is their god? Is anarchy their god? Are they atheists? Are they like the communists? Communists had a religion. Do the ANCAPs have a religion?
Now know why governments always will become more authoritarian.
See, they have articles of faith.
And why they are doomed to collapse.
Articles of faith.
Yes, and you may have noticed that currency created by the state cannot have value as it doesn't have scarcity.
That's an article of faith. Currencies created by governments sometimes are coined in gold, and the rand is a dollar. Is it South Africa? The South African rand is a dollar as a gold coin that's currently in circulation and used all over the world. So that's not true. These are articles of faith.
And since it's created out of thin air, its utility,
not all governments do that. Some governments have coined gold money.
Is virtually non-existent by itself. And it's about this point where it's important to explain that late statism and late stage statism are two different things. Late statism is the general idea that governments are structurally unsustainable, and late stage statism is a pattern of emergent behaviors and actions which can be observed by the government towards the end of late statism. And there are two parts to the cycle of late statism. There is when the state forms and when it becomes entirely dependent on fractional reserve banking. Now, the US has an interesting history which is different from the failed states of the past.
It messes with your theories a little bit there, doesn't it?
In that the US attempted to jump into late stage statism before they were forced to out of economic necessity. This is evidenced by the fact that 3 decades after signing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Bretton Woods Agreement was formed to make the US dollar a reserve note again in 1944. And yes, you will notice within that 30-year period where the US jumped headfirst into late-stage statism, the US involved itself into World War I and World War II, as well as the Great Depression occurring. This is not a coincidence.
The Great Depression was caused by the United States government, but I don't know what his view of it is.
And we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, what causes late-stage statism is quite simple. The state has to try and maintain its exponential growth curve while not being able to produce anything and consequently being only able to utilize money that's value comes from.
Now, part of the solution to this, and it's not a good thing that the state's going to continue to grow, but part of the solution to it is that our economy grows, right? And as long as our economy grows faster than the state, we should be okay as long as the state is held within the bounds of a constitution. But the state's definitely going to grow. I mean, we're going to have things like, by popular demand, we're going to have a sort of police officer of whatever, food safety maybe, who goes into factories and makes sure that, tests food. I know that it's probably better done by the private market, so maybe that's a bad example, but let's see. We will have police officers on airplanes, maybe, and boats and stuff. We'll have, oh God, I've forgotten what my original example was. What was he? Oh, Jesus.
Not being able to produce anything and consequently being only able to utilize money that's value comes from debt. This is harmful for its market because as the state growth curve while not being able to produce anything, and this is not a coincidence, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, what causes late-stage statism is quite simple. The state has to try and maintain its exponential growth curve while not being able to produce anything and consequently being only able to utilize money.
So will there be growth in government as economy grows? Valid growth, objective growth in an objective government? Yeah, I think so, because I think there will be more things to investigate, more laws to enforce, laws against cyber crimes have to be written, laws against using lasers have to be written, laws against using drones inappropriately have to be written. And then we have to have lawyers and specialists in those things and scientists or whatever. And so I think that if we have a robust, large, growing economy, I think that the government will grow, maybe slower, maybe not in lockstep, right? And it looks to me like there will be growth in government in a rational economy. And the way that we mitigate that is by outgrowing them, by growing faster than them. So, this happened under Reagan. Reagan did a bunch of increase in spending and a bunch of tax cuts, and everybody's heads fell off. They said, oh my God, everybody's going to die. It's going to destroy the whole world. And the economy boomed, and the decreased tax rates resulted in more tax revenue because of the booming economy. So they actually got more revenue than they were planning to get before by cutting taxes. So that happens too. I don't know. This is a religion, I'm afraid.
Money that's value comes from debt. This is harmful for its market because as the state increases its taxes and creates more regulations, it becomes more difficult for producers to enter the market since it costs more capital to invest. And this consequently leads to less employment and more expensive commodities since there are fewer producers, and the producers who are in the market aren't able to produce as much or hire as many people as they would without the state.
All right, is that just Malthusianism there? Is that just Malthus?
Headfirst into late-stage statism, the U.S. involved itself into World War I and World War II, as well as the Great Depression occurring.
Okay.
This is not a coincidence, and we'll get back to that in a moment.
All right.
Now, what causes late-stage statism is quite simple. The state has to try and maintain its exponential growth curve while not being able to produce anything and consequently being only able to utilize money that's value comes from debt. This is harmful for its market.
All right, so I think we will have legitimate growth of government in an objective society, and it will not be the metaphysical disaster that he is portraying it as. It's just an article of faith for him the government will grow exponentially out of control. I don't think that that is an essential of government. It's maybe an essential of certain types of government, like statist government.
Because as the state increases its taxes and creates more regulations, it becomes more difficult for producers to enter the market since it...
All right. See, regulations are not an essential. Regulations are not an essential of government. In fact, the United States of America has less and fewer regulations than a lot of economies around the world, and that's the source of our freedom and productivity. So, so the fact that we can have some countries with less regulation means that regulation is not an essential. If regulation were an essential of government, if all governments are definitely going to essentially regulate the economy, then that's Soviet Russia. Every government is in some way Soviet Russia. In his view, you know, he can't tell the difference between any given government and any other. They all look like Soviet Russia to him. But that is not the case. The United States is a standing example against it.
Costs more capital to invest, and this consequently leads to less employment and more expensive commodities since there are fewer producers, and the producers who are in the market aren't able to produce as much or hire as many people as they would without the state, leading to less economic activity and in turn less actual resources being produced by the private producers. Now,
all right, that's just the runaway effects of socialist economy and socialist planning.
Without central banking, this would make the state unsustainable alone because eventually politicians would have to establish a command economy as a consequence, which is a problem because without supply and demand curves, it's not possible to properly allocate resources. Fiat currency works.
So that's a collapse. When you think you have to establish a command economy, that's a collapse.
The same way. However, currency or money differs from commodities in that the state can only make trade with commodities less profitable. But with fiat currency, the only way it can have any sort of tangible market value is through economic manipulation.
Well, not all governments are going to use fiat currency. Not all governments ever have. It's not an essential of government. It's just late stage governments. It's just the late-stage governments that he's worried about today that prove his point.
Doesn't change anything or make it any more sustainable. The utility that consumers perceive is still...
What if Trump reestablishes the gold standard, which I've seen things on Facebook that they're talking about. I doubt Trump probably doesn't even want it. He probably believes it would be bad for the economy. But just for a little experiment, what if he did? What would that do for this guy's? What if not only that, but what if the Tea Party gets bigger and stronger, and we actually do away with Obamacare and get the government out of healthcare and get the government out of education? What if we start rolling some of this stuff back? How would that fit his theory here?
Completely made up.
Maybe we won't, though. Maybe we can't roll it back.
It's just smoke and mirrors. But this is primarily where governments begin to enter late-stage statism. In order to attempt and sustain the fiat currency they're pushing, governments will form international treaties with other governments to force producers of the world to only trade with the currency they want them to. In the case of the United States, that agreement is OPEC, which is why the U.S.'s foreign policy for the last 40 years has been so heavily centered around oil and aggression for the last 50.
Now, what is that? Something about OPEC and money, oil money? What? Oil is important to our economy. That's why that's going on. It's just the stability of the dollar. What? All right, whatever. I can't worry about what it was. It's too much. It's too much. OPEC, the Middle East is important because oil was important to us until very, very recently, till like 2012 or something. We had to import gargantuan quantities of oil. In the 90s, we imported a lot of oil. So the Middle East was important to us. That's why we're interested over there. Not to prop up our dollar, something like that, or lend our dollar credence or something like that.
Policy for the last 40 years has been so heavily centered around oil and aggression for the last 50. Coercion is temporarily
for the last 50? What about World War I and World War II? Or maybe those weren't aggression.
able to keep the statist economy from collapsing during late-stage statism. This is a process which is known as cartelism. Two other consequences.
If World War I and World War II were considered part of our aggression, or whatever he said about that, then that's 100-year long period already. That's pretty long. Are we supposed to be in terminal decline yet, or can we be in decline for more than 100 years? That's a long time.
Consequences of this attempt by the state at market manipulation are the boom-bust cycle and wars, both of which occur as a result of the state seeking to manipulate interest rates by loaning hundreds of millions of dollars into investment banks and arms producers, and attempting to stimulate demand for their country's fiat currency. So, of course, historically, this hasn't
Not all governments control interest rates, and they don't have to. And if they do, they don't have to do such a bad job as that, but they sometimes do.
led to the end of governments. Usually when governments reach the end of late-stage statism and collapse, a new government or new governments form. The Roman Empire, for example, became the British and Byzantine empires, both of which dissolved into multiple different countries of their own, which are now mostly defunct and reformed into new governments. You get the idea. The inevitable fact that all governments will inevitably default does not lead to statelessness naturally, because the society is not an immediately competitive one without the state. It still has a monopoly on arbitration, or a power vacuum as some refer to it.
It has a monopoly on arbitration or a power vacuum? That's a very strange sentence.
And politicians from the former government generally end up taking ownership of the monopoly on arbitration and creating a new constitution to repeat the same process over and over again. However, with new commodities constantly being innovated into existence, which make our means of association more decentralized.
Do new commodities constantly get innovated into existence? Where does that happen? Seems like that doesn't happen everywhere, does it? Was that the case in the Dark Ages? Lots of new commodities? Lots of new commodities coming out, huh? When do we get new commodities? Where do these come from? Who produces new commodities? Blank out. It's just a fact of nature in the ANCAP's silly little pea-brain imagination. It's just a fact of nature that companies exist and they produce new, better things all the time. That is just a fact of nature that they can't get their pea-brains around.
And through the invention of cryptography-based trade, which is a money by definition that holds value due to its scarcity and the overwhelming abilities which can be utilized efficiently. When the states collapsed this time...
Was that just a plug for cryptocurrency, which is not currency? I bought some Bitcoin, but I didn't buy it as a currency. I bought it as like a space on a trading platform. There's this trading platform with 32 million square spaces on it, and the more of that trading platform you own, the more you can buy, sell, and trade real world goods. So I bought it as part of a trading platform. Is it money? I don't know. Insofar as it's scarce and people are willing to trade for it, it's a commodity. So I think gold is probably the only real money.
People will be able to store their assets into alternative means of association like cryptocurrencies. We've already seen that in some of the recent bad days for the stock market, the demand for crypto increased at the same rate that demand for gold did. Consumers view crypto as a preferred medium of exchange similar to gold or silver. And when the demand...
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a permanent state of affairs. 5 or 10 years from now, that might be very, very different.
For crypto reaches a certain point, the market will stabilize, which will only cause it to become more valuable as the value of the dollar plummets and the regulated market becomes more expensive and impossible to trade in. So with this counter economy, which exists now, but will dominate after the state collapses, it doesn't...
There will not be cryptocurrency after the states collapse. If states collapse, there won't be cryptocurrency. It'd be anarchy. Go to Syria and see how much is going on over there. See how much innovation and new products are coming out of Syria today.
Appear as if the state has a realistic future, because if the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized,
there won't be an internet if the government collapses. There won't even be electricity to run the internet so that you can have your stupid cryptocurrencies.
trade, which can't be tracked or monitored by design, it can't be regulated. And if trade can't be regulated, then it can't be taxed, which means that a state forming would be impossible, and that a competitive market would consequently form immediately as.
Oh, okay. So if we can keep the internet, and we can keep all the goodies that we have today, and get rid of the state, then blah, 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 blah. That is such utter nonsense.
Future, because if the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade, which can't be.
If the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade, does he mean to say if the entire economy, if trade becomes decentralized?
Entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade, which can't be tracked or monitored by design, it can't be regulated. And if.
So this is some sort of magical trade that can't be regulated, can't be tracked or monitored by design, therefore you can't regulate it.
Trade can't be regulated, then it can't be taxed.
And therefore it can't be taxed. So the internet is going to lead to a magical form of trade that's invisible and the government can't tax it. That's what I got there.
Which means that a state forming would be impossible.
Therefore, a state can't even form. All right, well, if all that stupid magic happens, I guess maybe a state can't form. That's ridiculous.
And that a competitive market would consequently form immediately as.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Oh, they have to get their competitive market somewhere because it's the base of their whole thing, isn't it? Competitive market does not exist in Mexico. All right? Competitive market does not exist in Cuba. All right? The competitive market isn't just a metaphysical fact of the universe that you get to use and have it pop back into existence right after the government collapses because you got some sort of magical trade that they can't see or can't follow.
Dominate after the state collapses. It doesn't appear as if the state has a realistic future, because if the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade.
All right, decentralized trade, meaning what? How is decentralized trade going to not be trackable or taxable?
Which can't be tracked or monitored by design. It
can't be tracked or monitored. Now, the question I would just put there is there such a thing as trade that can't be tracked or monitored? I mean, he says by design, so we'll just simply design it that way. Well, that seems magical to me. You can't track this trade or monitor this trade. Now, if the blockchain technology is what you're talking about, criminals have discovered something very scary about Bitcoin. That's that every single purchase ever made is in every single purchase ever made, and it just keeps being reiterated. So every time somebody makes a purchase, it reiterates every single purchase ever made. So the purchase the criminals made are in the blockchain. So what does he mean? He's got this magical thing that nobody can track? That's bizarre. Now, if nobody can track it, then nobody can regulate it. So we can just have a private economy free of government regulation. Now, what would go on there? Would any crimes go on there? Because the government can't regulate it. No, it's magical. The government can't see it. That's really strange.
appear as if the state has a realistic future, because if the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade, which can't be tracked or monitored by design,
Oh,
it
boy.
can't be regulated. And if trade can't be regulated, then it can't be taxed, which
All right, so we're in a tax-free zone now because of all this magical bullshit.
means that a state forming would be impossible.
Since you can't tax anything, you can't have a state. So we've got these people running around on some kind of internet without a government there without a government there to form the infrastructure of the internet, or oi polloi, okay. And on this internet, they are trading free, but they're invisible. The government can't see them, so the government can't tax them. So the government can't form. Wow. A government can't form because it can't get onto the internet, or when it does, it can't figure out what's going on the internet. Therefore, society will just flourish free on the internet without any interference from the government and without any taxation. And nobody with guns will come and mess any of this up.
And that a competitive market would consequently form immediately as the state collapsed. So this was
As the state collapsed, a competitive market would form. That is utopian Marxist la la land religious thinking, isn't it? That is the essence of la la land religious thinking.
a competitive market would consequently form immediately as the state collapsed.
Good God.
Taxed, which means that a state forming would be impossible, and that a competitive market would consequently form immediately as the state collapsed.
Good God.
So this was an explanation of late statism. If you
No, this was a goddamn wreck. This is a religious catechism. This is articles of faith. This is you looking at the governments around you today and naming some things about them that don't work or are improper, and then saying that you have a theory of everything, theory of government and the theory of society, because you look at a few incompetent governments around you today. Well, I don't know. What's the, I think the cure for this is just more knowledge. I think they just need to study and learn more. It's probably bad philosophy at its base. They might even have such bad philosophy that they won't be able to understand a good argument when they come to it. That's certainly the case with people who take Immanuel Kant seriously. So I don't know what you guys, you dunce caps are in a rough situation here. I call ANCAPs dunce caps. You guys are in a rough situation. You're backing yourself into a religion with articles of faith, and you're certainly not able to think critically about the situation because you have told everybody to bug off with that critical thinking stuff. You're just going to base your thoughts on correct principles and not contradict yourself. And you guys are ending up with a religion in your floating little mind that you think doesn't contradict itself, so you think you're good. But it's detached from reality. It has articles of faith, and you look ridiculous. Ladies and gentlemen, the dunce caps.